Are you a quilter who's interested in learning more about sewing garments? This video has some useful tips, notes, and ideas as you consider adding another textile art to your skill set. And it has a case study of sorts. My mom. She is a prolific quilter. She's always creating something beautiful, but recently, me and my sister kind of coerced her into expanding her quilting skills and to make some clothes for herself. When it comes to sewing, we think that she's extremely talented. In fact, she keeps her long arm at the Love Notion Sewing Pattern workshop where we work. And so over the past few years, we've gotten to really get a close look at a lot of the effort that goes into making a quilt. I have to tell you, she is leaving quite a legacy for her family. All of us, her 4 daughters and our families, including her 12 grandchildren, we each have a specially crafted quilt from her. She's even created a quilt to hang in almost every single room of our workshop. She's always working on something to give to friends and other members of our family. So you can obviously see that my mom is an incredibly talented quilter. And it just so happens that my sister Tammy is a fantastic garment sewing pattern designer. With all this experience and talent, I just knew that we needed to get my mom onto the garment sewing train so that she could use her talents for pieces that were just for her and not everybody else. So in today's video, I want to share with you some of my mom's insights as a quilter potentially entering into the garment sewing world. And hopefully, if you are a quilter, you too can decide whether garment sewing is a good fit for you. In this video, we're going to talk about the similarities between quilting and garment sewing and why it might be a totally realistic transition for you. And we'll also talk about some garment sewing pointers, specifically for quilters, like the tools, some info that you would want to understand about garment sewing compared to quilting, the pattern tutorials, and then some of the other realizations and connections that my mom made as she jumped back into sewing and sewing garments after a really long, decades-long hiatus. So her unique perspective might be really helpful to you as a quilter. And to wrap up, and throughout the video, we'll also just discuss a couple of specific garment patterns and other resources that might be just right for you as a quilter. But before we get there, and because you might not have a couple of daughters that are coercing you into trying out garment sewing, I just want to mention really quickly some reasons why you as a quilter might want to jump into garment sewing. First, you love textile arts in general and you want to pick up another hobby. Another reason for you getting into garment sewing might be that you have a bunch of fabric in your stash that would make some really great clothes. Or number 3, you used to sew clothes all the time and now you're ready to get back into it. And connected to that, number 4, you sewed garments a long time ago and you're ready to learn about all of the innovations and advancements that there have been in garment sewing, specifically with indie sewing pattern companies. Or number 5, maybe you want to get into garment sewing because you want clothes that are as much an art as your quilts are. Or number 6, you want some quick sewing projects that are way less expensive and way less time and labor intensive. Or number 7, and this is the most convincing for me, you want some clothes that fit and feel great. Quilts are cozy and awesome, and they're works of art. But unfortunately, you can't exactly always wear them outside in your daily life, like I do with my home sewn wardrobe. There's something about having clothes that just you're so proud of and that feel great. So you can see that there are a lot of benefits to adding garment sewing to your sewing skill set. So now let's talk about some of the similarities between garment sewing and quilting, as well as the pattern that we used that offers quilters just a little bit more of some common ground as they start their garment sewing journey. So in terms of similarity in garment sewing and quilting, there are just like some obvious quilter skills that translate really well into garment sewing. Both garment sewing and quilting require just a certain amount of precision, a certain amount of attention to detail, and just some general sewing knowledge, like how to use a machine and how to cut out fabric and all that kind of thing. So in my mom's case, we thought that the best pattern to start her out with was one that was totally wearable, that was quick to sew, and one that incorporated some very typical quilter. So we used the Rhapsody blouse. Ever since my sister designed this literally award-winning pattern, my mom has really, really loved it. But she wasn't ready or completely motivated to sew it herself quite yet. There was just too many things in the way. Because in contrast to quilting, garment sewing requires some learning about fitting specifically. Also learning about selecting your size, about understanding the different garment fabrics that are right for garment sewing, and some knowledge about just getting the pattern correctly formatted and taken from her computer download to an assembled, ready-to-use pattern. And all of that together just seemed a little bit too intimidating. And those were the skills that she hadn't quite learned yet. So in our journey together sewing Rhapsody, we picked the Rhapsody blouse because it's a great pattern for quilters to start with. It has tons of versatile options, lots of sleeves and ways that you can wear it. You can make it a top or a dress, and it's really elegant and classic. And for a quilter, it's totally beginner friendly. Like that tie front binding. As a quilter, she already knew how to make and apply bias tape. So that was one confidence building detail. And as far as fit, Rhapsody is a really lovely fitting pattern. And the beauty of it is that it doesn't have a lot of complicated darts or closures. In fact, the only closure is the tie if you want to tie it. And it's really easy to fit. Because who wants to spend all that time on something just to not have it fit right, you know? So you should know that today, Love Notions is featuring this pattern in our $5 Feature Friday sale. That's a weekly sale that we have. So that means that Rhapsody is offered at a really big special. It's just $5, and regularly it's $12.50. So it's a fantastic value, and these weekly Feature Fridays are a great way for quilters or people who are new to sewing to try out new patterns without breaking the bank. Now, let's talk about some of the tips that my quilter mom has for you if you're a quilter interested in venturing into garment sewing. And if you're a garment sewist already, please be sure to share these with your quilter friends. The first tip is to start with a woven, beginner-friendly pattern, like the Rhapsody blouse. You want to look for one that has not very many closures at all or no darts, and having those absent from the pattern will make fitting easier. There are a few other woven patterns at Love Notions that would be good options to start with as well. I think the Cadence top and dress would be great. The Oakley vest, or especially the new Coda quilted coat. Those would all be great places to start if you're looking for a pattern that can use your quilting cottons or those other types of fabric that you're more familiar with. So you can see that Rhapsody uses a bias binding. We already talked about that. So it's a great idea to work with a garment pattern that has some construction techniques that you as a quilter would be more comfortable with. Next, my quilter mom suggests that you read the pattern all the way through. Now, when you're comparing and contrasting garment sewing patterns to quilting patterns, you'll know that PDF garment sewing patterns are completely different than quilting patterns. And honestly, they're completely different than regular garment patterns that you can pick up in the big fabric stores. Indie patterns are really full of instructions and clear pictures and step-by-step tutorials to get you to a great piece. Many of these tutorials have links to videos, they have really close-up views, and they're written as if you are a beginner sewist, like this is your very first time. Very, very little is assumed about the user's skill level when it comes to PDF garment sewing patterns. At least that's true for Love Notions. They are very approachable for someone at any level. And in contrast, most quilting patterns, at least that I've seen, to me, are unreadable almost. There's just so much that quilting pattern authors take for granted that a quilter knows. There's all those abbreviations, that vernacular. I am way more scared of quilting patterns than even the most complicated garment sewing pattern from an indie designer. I know that I will get lots of hand-holding. Now, number 3, the next tip is actually about accessing the printed or the formatted part of the sewing pattern. And I think this was my mom's biggest holdup when it came to sewing garments, as someone who normally quilts is familiar with that process. So she totally understood how to access a quilt tutorial where you just kind of like download a few pages, like a booklet maybe, with the instructions and the images that you need. But with garment sewing, there's just a few more steps and hurdles to jump through. So we both suggest watching the videos that we've got on this YouTube channel for using PDF patterns. You could just search PDF patterns inside of our channel and you'll find them. But one is about using PDF patterns and one is about assembling PDF patterns. You should know that when it comes to garment sewing PDF patterns, you have to have an accurately printed pattern at just the right size and dimensions and all that stuff. So we use a free program called Acrobat Reader, and it's just this special reader program that you put the pattern download into, and then that spits out a pattern that's going to project or print correctly. After you get into Acrobat Reader, you've got to work on printing it at home or through a printing service, and you can even use a projector, which is a whole nother technology. So watching the videos that we've got on our channel about PDF patterns would be really helpful for you. Luckily, my mom had me and my sister walking her through it. And basically, you can get those same instructions from us in those videos that I mentioned. And I'll be sure to link them in the description box as well. And just so you know, when it comes to printing the pattern, there is a print layout that tells you exactly how to tile out the pattern pieces. And there's also a print chart in the tutorial, so you don't have to print out every single page of these big files. You can just print out what you need. Right. The next thing she suggests is choosing fabrics that you're comfortable working with, such as cotton. But for Rhapsody, I do think that a more drapey garment fabric, something that's more flexible, that a stiff quilter's cotton is not going to give you the same result. So while you should work with something you're comfortable with, I'd go for garment sewing with like a lawn or a linen. Those would be great to sew with, at least for Rhapsody, but it would have a really great amount of drape. For my mom's Rhapsody, we used a really nice piece of chambray tencel. This was just a teensy bit slippery in comparison to a regular quilter cotton, but it wasn't nearly as shifty as a rayon challis or a peach skin or something silky like that. And so just to make it a little bit easier, my mom was sure to work with some starch. Another little tip for a quilter is to first make a quick muslin or a test garment in a similar fabric to your intended final fabric. I actually did this part for my mom just because I'm a little bit faster at garment sewing. She's very precise and takes everything step by step very slowly. So this is something that my mom wouldn't obviously have to do as a quilter, but as a garment sewist, she realized that it was really important. First, we did her measurements together. We found exactly the right size blend that worked best for her. And then I just sewed the main body pieces, the front, the back, the yoke, the sleeves real quick. And we put it on just to see how it looked. And because this was a trial, we left off all of the extra finishing parts like the bias tape and the hem and like all those extra details. And we used that to check the fit before we invested a lot of time into a final piece. So we checked the fit in the bust, the arms, the shoulders, just to make sure everything felt good. We also looked at the length, and she was able to kind of customize that to what she wanted. So after we did that, we just did a tiny little tweak, and then she was ready to go with her final fabric, which she sewed herself. I already have. My mom has a few tools that she worked with as a garment sewist that a quilter might not already have. As a quilter, she relies heavily on pressing with an iron, straight pins, and lots of rulers. But with garment sewing, here are a few tools that would be nice to have handy. First, wonder clips. My mom usually works with straight pins, but the clips were really the way to go with many of the steps in a garment sewing project. Number two, another tool that she used is a good measuring tape. I know rulers and straight edges are really key for quilting, but with garment sewing, you're gonna wanna have a really great measuring tape just to make sure that you get the right sizing to start off the bat so that you can have a garment that fits you great. Another important tool is a pressing cloth. Now, when it comes to quilting, my mom is obsessive when it comes to pressing. And that sort of fabric is able to stand up to lots of heat. But when you're working with the kind of garment fabric that we're working with, you had to be a little bit more careful about pressing that fabric. So I highly suggest a pressing cloth to really help you get that crisp press, but also to protect the fabric. And a quilter probably has a ton of tools and notions centered around quilting. But if you're looking to be ready for garment sewing projects, you're gonna need some more typical garment sewing notions. Not for Rhapsody, but for other projects, you're gonna want things like elastic in various sizes. You're gonna want some interfacing that's meant for wovens and a different kind for knits. You might wanna have some zippers on hand and a zipper machine foot. You're gonna wanna have a collection of buttons and a buttonhole foot, and it might even be nice to have a walking foot for your sewing machine. If you get really into garment sewing, you might even want to step up your machine game by adding in a serger. And that's the way you get a really nice finish on the inside for your seams, especially with knits. And if you get into garment sewing, you might even want to invest in a cover stitch, which offers a really professional hem. So there are a few tools that we just talked about that a quilter might want to add into their arsenal for sewing projects. But just to help out even a little bit further, here's a few warnings that my quilter mom has for anyone who plans to sew garments. One is about fabric markings and fabric in general. Quilter's fabric doesn't have the same kind of tendency to get misshapen through like lots of handling and maybe a little stretching. A quilting fabric will usually stay true to what was caught, and those markings will stay true as well. But garment fabric is usually quite a bit more shifty, even if you're using a woven. It could be really important for you as a quilter getting into garment sewing. It might be really good for you to invest in a good marking tool and to be really careful when you cut and when you're handling your fabric to avoid it getting misshapen or stretched out. Another warning is to be ready to not have to be quite so precise with your garment sewing. While quilting, it requires you to be completely careful with every minute measurement, especially with the seam allowances. It's critical. But with garment sewing, there is a little bit more flexibility, especially within seam allowances. Obviously, you need to follow them carefully, but there's just a little bit more room to not have to be so exact with every seam. Just, you can be a little bit more flexible. In fact, I think one of the benefits of garment sewing is that you can actually dip into the seam allowance in appropriate places or take it a little wider at times to accommodate your body better with the fitting. So you could do that instead of having to recut a new size or to make pattern adjustments. So to an extent, it's just like a little bit more flexible for fitting without compromising the final product, like it would be if you were to kind of get a little bit more loose with your seam allowances in quilting. And speaking of, when it comes to garment sewing, you should really take a careful look at the seam allowance directions throughout the pattern tutorial and the seam allowances that are printed on the individual pattern pieces themselves. Love Notion's patterns include the seam allowance like built into the pattern pieces. Some other companies and some other garment patterns, they require you to add in your own seam allowance onto the actual pattern piece yourself. So just know that that's included for Love Notions, but you need to keep an eye out for any changes that happen because it's not always going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance like you're used to. It might change anywhere from a 3/8 seam allowance to a 5/8 seam allowance. And next, I guess this is a warning, but I also think it's just like a huge check in the pros column when it comes to garment sewing. With garment sewing, you might be ready for projects to take a lot less time. My mom's quilts take weeks and months to plan, to cut, to sew, to quilt, and to bind. Easily months. But with garment sewing, you can typically get a wearable piece and you can make it in a few days or really even an afternoon. So be ready for some quicker results. And lastly, don't be afraid to ask for help or to seek some guidance from all of the online tutorials and communities that we have, like the ones that are on the Love Notions website, where we've got a wealth of resources for sewists of all skill levels in our blog or on this channel. But you can also look at our private Facebook pattern support group where you can sew something up, take a picture, and then ask for help when it comes to construction and especially with fitting. There are just like a ton of people that are ready to assist you and encourage you in your new garment sewing skills. So that's my mom's take on garment sewing from a quilter's perspective. She's taken the plunge into garment sewing, and those are some of her experiences, her connections, her warnings, and even some of her advice to help you cross over that bridge into sewing clothing. I hope that it was helpful. Quilters, let me know if you have any other questions or video requests. And garment sewists, feel free to drop into the comments here with any of your advice for a quilter who is considering garment sewing. You can find even more info, beginner-friendly projects, sewing hacks, and even full sewing courses at lovenotions.com. Happy sewing!